ADHD and ADD are common mental illnesses that an estimated 6.4 million children in the United States have. But these illnesses aren't talked about outside of your typical health class. Many don't realize how common it is and how even students in your class can have them. Yes, even the ones who don't disrupt class. These students aren't being acknowledged and helped in the way that they should. A study written by Tracy Penderston states that 1 in 3 students with ADHD receive no help in schools. The best way to help these children is through school, so why aren't they getting the support they need? Many schools are lacking in how they provide education to children who have ADHD or ADD, including Cascade. To start researching this topic, we first talked to Mrs. Cox to explain what ADHD is and how it affects a person. So, what exactly is ADHD or ADD?
So ADD or ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and it's actually constructed as a mental health illness. And it's a mental health illness because it affects a person's thinking and emotional capacity and mood.
How does ADHD or ADD affect a person?
Well, it affects people because ultimately it impacts a lot of aspects of their life. Ultimately, the way that it impacts the brain is that it makes concentrating really challenging. So being able to think and process information and retain it can be more difficult. If you get interrupted 5 times as you're trying to finish a problem, obviously it's going to take you a lot longer, and that's kind of sometimes the way that the brain works, is that when they're trying to focus on something, tasks that might seem easy to some become increasingly more challenging to others. So if you think about it from that capacity, I mean, it really affects a person. It also affects people in the way that they have relationships, because people with ADHD tend to be impulsive, and sometimes the things that they say aren't necessarily appropriate, because sometimes they say things without really thinking through the context of the meaning behind their statement.
As someone on the outside, how could you tell if someone has ADHD or ADD?
That's a good question. So a lot of times you'll know that somebody, well, not always, right? You assume somebody might have ADHD symptoms when they're impulsive. So they are constantly saying things or blurting things out. They process at a much more rapid rate in some ways with just, again, some of the things in which they communicate. Hyperactive, so they're constantly having to move and fidget. They have to stand, they have to constantly be touching things, so sometimes it can come off pestering to some, and to others it can be distracting, like pen tapping or like foot tapping are oftentimes things that you might notice. And then of course, not focusing on a task. So if they start to work on a school assignment, a lot of times you'll notice, because they get off task really easily. And then of course, they oftentimes do really well in social environments in some circumstances, and so they'll engage in side conversations instead of doing the work.
Next, we talk to Gavin Legner, a student who has ADHD, to tell us more about it and what he has experienced.
How did you find out you had ADHD?
When I was really young, I had a lot of trouble focusing on everything. I struggled a lot in elementary school. I barely passed elementary school because I couldn't focus on my work. And honestly, we should have known a lot sooner, but by the time I was in middle school, I was diagnosed with ADHD by my doctor.
Okay. How do you think ADHD affects you specifically?
It makes things a lot harder than normal people probably should experience, because you'll be working on something, and then you'll instantly think of something that happened 3 years ago, and then that's all you can think about, and so you don't know how to kind of come back to where you were focusing on.
How do you deal with your ADHD?
I actually have medication for my ADHD. It's a patch called Daytrona, and I put it on a muscly area of my body, and it doesn't really matter where, as long as I'm rotating it, and it'll distribute a stimulant that helps me focus.
Have you ever been treated differently because you have ADHD?
Yes, I have. When I was in middle school and elementary school, I had a lot of trouble with teachers, and I would argue with them a lot because they would just yell at me to focus, but I couldn't. And I've never really had any friends that kind of pointed out, but I never knew until a few years ago that I had it, so they didn't know either. But I would say that I was treated differently in some aspects.
Okay. Did they ever try to help you at all, or did they just tell you off and not do anything else?
I don't think any of them ever really like knew that I had ADHD. I think they just thought I was an overhyped kid that couldn't focus, and so no, they didn't really help at all. It was my parents that like decided that I should be tested to be tested for ADHD, and so they're the ones that helped, not any teachers or any councils or anything like that.
Would you say that the education system doesn't know how to help a student with ADHD, or do they just not try?
I don't think. I think it goes in turn with like they don't know, and so they don't care to ask, and so it kind of is they don't want to try. I think a lot of people would be treated a lot more like with ADHD if like teachers actually asked, and if like they asked if you've been diagnosed at all.
Next, we talk to Eli Moore, a student at Cascade, to give us an outsider's perspective. Here's what they had to say.
Have you ever met anyone who has ADHD or ADD that you know of?
Yes.
What do you think of when you hear ADHD or ADD?
A lot of distractions and like having trouble concentrating.
Do you think people with ADHD or ADD are treated differently in society or just in general?
They definitely are, especially because they're usually thought of as like stupid or just like are made a joke of. They aren't always like given the correct tools to like help them if they do need it and stuff like that.
Yeah. Do you think you can tell when somebody has ADHD?
No, it's not something that you can really tell about a person.
What do you know about ADHD or ADD, and what do you think it is?
Attention deficit disorder and attention hyperactivity something disorder. Is more like having problems focusing because of your brain's inability to just like stop thinking for a second and like taking in a whole bunch of things at random times.
Do you think Cascade is doing anything to help students with ADHD or ADD?
I think some teachers definitely are. Like they allow students to like go on walks if like they have like serious problems. Like Medlock, for example, has given certain students like the option to like walk or lap like in the morning to study, so they can like get out their energy while also like focusing on multiple things at once, so that they can actually study. So some teachers.
Then we spoke with Mr. Medlock, who not only is accepting of students with ADHD and ADD, he also has ADD himself and explains what it's like for him to have this mental illness. So, how did you figure out you had ADD?
My wife told me for years that she thought I had ADD, and then I said, no, that's ridiculous. I'm high functioning, I have a job and all that kind of thing. And then she had me take an online ADD test, and I started taking it, and then I got bored and stopped. And she said, how'd you do? And I said, I got bored and stopped. And she went, so I went to the doctor, and he sent me to a specialist because he didn't think I have ADD either. And the specialist diagnosed me as there's high functioning, high performing ADD. And he said that the reason why I'm getting by in life is because of anxiety. So anxiety acts like a stimulant to me, and it'll light up my frontal lobe.
Okay. So, how does your ADD affect you?
The big one that I hear from my colleagues here in school is that I'm socially awkward, and I am. So I will miss things in social settings. I'll say things that I think are actually true without regard to how it will affect the people around me. And I'm not trying to be cruel, it just doesn't occur to me to think about that. Large groups of people, I know I'm going to make more social mistakes the more interactions I have, so I try to avoid large groups of people, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
If I get rolling in class, sometimes I'll say weird things if I'm lecturing without thinking about how they're going to land. You know?
okay. So, how do you deal with your mental illness?
Now I take a mild stimulant. I don't take as much as I probably should. I'm suspicious of pills, I guess. That doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's how it is. But I've had therapy. I have adaptive behaviors, so if someone needs me to do something, hey, Mr. Medlock, could you blah, 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 I'll say, all right, I can't do it now, I can do it later, but you have to tell me because I'm going to forget. I say that all the time, right? And that might put the onus on other people, but I'm being honest up front. If you don't remind me, I'm not going to do it, that kind of thing. So, and lists, lots and lots of lists. I write lists all the time, but then I lose them. If I don't lose them, things go better.
Okay. Have you ever been treated because of your mental illness?
Yes. Yeah,
Definitely.
pretty extensively, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
After speaking to Mr. Medlock, we spoke to Mr. Schletty, a teacher who has experience dealing with kids with ADHD.
Have you ever met anyone who has ADHD or ADD that you know of?
Yes. My son has it, and now that I know a lot more about it, I can tell that there's probably quite a few people I've met over the years that have it.
What do you think of when you hear ADHD or ADD?
I used to think that it was not really an excuse, but just kind of this thing that, like, that's just how somebody acted and people were using it as something that kind of explained their behavior. But as I learned more about it, with my son having it, and educated myself a lot more about it, I feel a lot differently about it now.
Okay. Do you think people with ADHD or ADD are treated differently in society?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's not enough people that are actually educated enough about what it is and what, how people's brains are wired that way. I think that too many people are quick to judge somebody as just being like hyper and or crazy or not having a filter, things like that. And I think that the more people learn about it, that there's ways that people can handle it differently and talk to people about it to actually help them.
Do you think you can tell when someone has ADHD?
Probably fairly easily, yes. Especially in like a classroom setting. If the person's like medicated and their medication is working, then no. But if the person has it and is undiagnosed or they're not on medication for it, it's, as a teacher, it's something that's fairly easy to spot, I think anyways.
Okay.
We talked to the teachers and asked if they learned how to teach students with ADHD, and if not, why do they think that is, and if they think it should be taught at all.
So, when you were learning how to teach, did you did you learn in any way to teach kids with ADHD or ADD?
Oh yeah. No, not at all. Not at all. No, I was taught that there was a thing called ADD, and that was basically it.
When you were training and learning how to teach kids and going into school, were you ever taught how to treat kids or help kids who have ADHD or ADD?
In my education program?
Yes.
Like through
Like
where?
through college.
In college, no. That was never something that really was brought up or discussed all that much. I mean, granted, I got into like high school teaching, so that was more my focus. I would think if that would be brought up, that would be something that maybe would be brought up more in an elementary type setting for future elementary teachers, because it's probably a little bit more prevalent there, where it's like that's where you're finding out that the kid has that and like probably point them in the right direction to get treatment for it. But in my ed program, that was never mentioned. I didn't really learn too much about it until I was in teaching for a little while and talking to other educators about it, and other professionals about it, and then talking to our family doctor about it when I learned that this is what my son has. So, yeah.
Why do you think that teachers don't learn about how to treat these mental illnesses in their classrooms?
It's a really good question. I don't know. I'm frustrated by it. I would love to have more resources available. I mean, that's why, you guys come here to learn. Teachers do the same thing. We do professional development. I think that it's one of those things that I think for a long time training programs never needed to incorporate it, but nowadays we have a lot more students that are being diagnosed with these conditions, and I just don't think that the education system has caught up per se with some of the things that they need to do.
Do you think that it should be something that you're taught when you're learning how to teach?
I think that it's something that should be at least brought up, because that'll help teachers, I guess maybe to an extent, learn to adapt better when you have kids that, aren't staying in their seat or are, blurting random things out or trying to be, I guess, the class clown, so to speak, and maybe help them with classroom management a little bit more in concerns to that. I don't think it needs to be like a huge focus or anything, because most of the time it's not like the worst thing or something that comes up. But yeah, I think it should at least be mentioned and talked about some in the ed program, yeah.
Then, we asked Mrs. Cox and Mr. Medlock what they think Cascade has done to help these students and how good of a job Cascade and its teachers are doing in helping them.
How do you think Cascade teachers are prepared for teaching a student with these mental illnesses?
It's a good question. As far as I'm aware, in my program, through school, we didn't cover conditions that oftentimes students experience or are impacted by, which blows me away. I really do believe that there needs to be a mental health course offered on campuses that is required for all educators to take, because ultimately, whether it be ADHD or dyslexia or a myriad of other circumstances, it impacts the way in which students learn. And having a course kind of with strategies would be really helpful. So we don't have that, but we do have a lot of strategies that obviously we pick up with, communicating with colleagues or talking about, hey, my student's experiencing these things, what can I do to help support them? And so a lot of times your colleagues are fantastic resources, counselors are great resources. So a lot of times what we'll do is it's kind of specified based upon the student. Sometimes they struggle more with the attention aspect, others struggle more with the hyperactivity aspect. I know sometimes when I've had students with ADHD, they're the ones who hand out all the materials. So then that way they're getting up and they're moving, but it's being productive, right? If I know people have a hard time concentrating, sometimes they're going to be given different tasks or different roles within the group that's going to better, support them in their learning style. And every teacher is a little bit different. Some people use a lot of strategies, and some teachers have different perspectives and teaching styles that might not be as conducive for these students.
So do you know anything that Cascade School District in general has done specifically to help students with mental illnesses, specifically ADHD or ADD?
Okay, so we obviously have, dependent upon if they are diagnosed, right? If a student is diagnosed with ADHD, there are education plans that can be put together for that student. So if we know that a student is the type that they're hyperactive, sometimes they're given certain luxuries or privileges, as I'd quote, right, that allow them to have bathroom breaks, maybe more than what's in this policy, because those students need to get up and they need to move. Other students, maybe they have a hard time concentrating, so maybe those individuals are given a plan that allows them to have access to notes rather than them having to take them themselves. So it's really dependent upon the person, whether or not they advocate for these plans to be put in place, and whether or not they follow through with them. But students who are undiagnosed and who don't advocate, it's dependent upon the communication between them and the instructor and what they agree to.
So how do you think Cascade is prepared to deal and teach kids with ADHD and ADD?
I think that our environment for a kid with ADD is way better than most high schools. One thing we seem to do is if you perform poorly on a test, we want to reteach you generally. And I'm not saying staff members have to do this, but generally we want to reteach you and give you an opportunity to be successful. It seems like with our homework policies, we would rather you do the work than punish you for not doing the work and then saying you can't do the work, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And for a person with ADD, that's very good, because people with ADD don't want to fail, and if you fail because you miss something, you feel like an idiot. And if there's a sort of a support network that encourages you to get things done on time, but if you don't, there are things you can do. I mean, that would have been paradise for me in school. I didn't have that. Mm-hmm. So
Today, We learned that our education system just isn't doing all they can in educating students and teachers about ADHD and what to do when you or your student has ADHD, even schools like Cascade. This is an issue that needs to be covered not only at the high school level, but at the college level when teaching educators. This is a serious problem that harms thousands of children, and it needs to be addressed.